2022 has been a non-stop year so far for my resurgence as a coaster enthusiast. And since the year is already half over, I thought it would be a great time to reflect upon all the coaster experiences I've had so far in 2022. With 31 new coaster credits and a ton of rides on many old favorites, I began realizing that there were some surprisingly large differences, both positive and negative, with this year's ride experiences compared to either the expectation I had in my mind for a new coaster or compared to my past ride experiences on old coasters. So whether it be a new or old coaster credit, and with reasons ranging anywhere from overall ride experience, all the way down to the minutia of ride restraint comfort, here are the top 10 coasters that, in some way, shape, or form, surprised me the most so far in 2022. Now, the way I rank these is by the overall level of surprise I felt, or in other words, how much the coaster varied either positively or negatively compared either to my past experiences on that coaster or compared to my own expectations for the new ones. I hope that makes sense. If not, please let me know down in the comments. Now let's get on with the countdown. Number 10, Hollywood Rip Ride Rockit at Universal Studios, Florida. Okay, so I know it's sort of the status quo thing to rip on Rip Ride Rockit, and I've admittedly never given it much credit in the past as being anything more than something I had only considered riding if the wait was less than 30 minutes. Plus, I'm pretty sure my wife Jeannie would tell you this is the worst coaster she's ever been on. So maybe her opinion started to rub off on me over the years. But during my Universal trip in May, I saw that the wait time was only 10 minutes, so I figured why not give it a go since it's usually never that short of a line. And man, was I ever glad I did. I had the best ride that I've ever had out of my few dozen rides on the thing. I mean, it was only just back in November when I had a couple rides on it, and it didn't leave me with any lasting impression. It was just sort of meh per usual. But this time was noticeably different. The ride was smoother, more comfortable, more forceful, and had better airtime, and was just way more enjoyable than I ever remembered it being. I'm definitely going to give this ride more credit from now on, and if any of you out there have heard negative reviews or have had some less than stellar rides in the past, I wouldn't let that discourage you from either riding it for your first time or riding it again whenever you next find yourself down at Universal Orlando. Kraken at SeaWorld Orlando lands in the number 9 spot and is a new coaster credit for 2022. I went into the ride with pretty low expectations since Rougarou was the only B&M floorless I'd ever been on up to that point, so a rougher, rattly ride with the potential of some headbanging is where my mind was at. Even with watching multiple ride POVs, nothing really seemed to stand out above the ordinary from the ride layout, and some people's reactions even confirmed the rattle. So I'm sure you can imagine my surprise after I get off the ride realizing that the ride was definitely smoother than I expected, had an awesome layout, and was one of the most forceful rides I've ever been on, in a good way. It also felt like a much longer ride than I expected, which is always a plus, and I just loved the interaction with the tunnels and trenches throughout the ride. I got off the ride saying, where did that come from? And even during the ride I started thinking to myself, oh, so this is what a good B&M floorless coaster feels like. At the end of the day, it did have a noticeable rattle, but nothing that really got in the way of the ride experience for me, and I even avoided any headbanging, which was great. Now, I only rode in the back row on both my rides, so it could totally be a different experience in a different row or seat, but let me know down in the comments what your experience was on Kraken and what row you prefer. Either way, Kraken was a real sleeper hit that you shouldn't gloss over if you find yourself at SeaWorld Orlando. Number 8, Valravn at Cedar Point. Okay, so Cedar Point is my home park, but believe it or not, prior to this year, I hadn't been on Valravn since all the way back in its opening year of 2016. I just remember not being too impressed with it after my first ride, so I never really bothered to wait for it whenever I'd be at the park, since the line always seemed longer than what the ride was worth. Long story short, I got my first ride this year on opening day and have since added a few dozen more up to this point. I am absolutely loving Valravn this year and can't believe it took me 6 years to give the coaster another shot. It is just pure fun and way better than I remember. I was able to ride SheiKra, another B&M dive coaster down at Busch Gardens, Tampa, about a week or so after Valravn. And for me, Valravn is clearly the better of the two. I've also heard people complain about Valravn's vest restraints getting in the way of potential airtime and being too snug, but I've thankfully found that not to be an issue for me at all on the rides I've had so far this year. I always get a ton of airtime every time and find the restraints to be more comfortable compared to the older B&M over-the-shoulder restraints. Ultimately, Valravn has become one of my favorite coasters at Cedar Point this year, and maybe you're like me and thought it was just sort of meh initially, but I wouldn't let that stop you from giving it another go next time you're at Cedar Point. Number 7. Fury 325 at Carowinds. Fury 325 at Carowinds is another new credit for me in 2022 and a massive check off of my coaster bucket list. Okay, so I usually try to set realistic, usually even low expectations for anything new I try. That way I can be pleasantly surprised more often than disappointed. But honestly, I just couldn't help myself and had some pretty high expectations for this because, it's Fury 325, one of the greatest coasters in the world that everyone seems to praise and love. I basically thought it would be a shoo-in to make my top 5, and maybe that ended up being a key mistake on my end. Side note, as of today, Fury 325 is not in my top 5, but did make my top 10. Anyway, the first thing that surprised me about the ride is that I was a bit underwhelmed after my initial 3 rides first thing in the morning. I went on row 2, row 1, and the back row, and I thought the back row was definitely the best out of those morning rides. But overall, it just didn't live up to what I had imagined in my head. Simply put, it felt slow. It seemed like it just crawled through the layout, and I left the ride thinking, man, I'm definitely like Orion better than that. Now, I knew for sure I'd give the coaster a few more goes in the afternoon since I figured it probably just needed to warm up for the day, and that did end up being the case. I snagged 3 more rides in the late afternoon and I finally got a taste of what I was expecting. The ride was such a different experience in the afternoon. It felt like twice as fast, and the different ride elements were just hitting full force, with of course much better airtime. I just still can't believe it felt that slow in the morning though. Let me know down in the comments if it's usually that much of a stark contrast between morning and afternoon, or if I just happened to catch it on a rare day. And don't worry, I definitely have Fury ranked ahead of Orion, in case you were wondering. Oh, and the last thing that surprised me about Fury 325 was the ride crew and how they close out the night. I've heard that they were great, but it's different when you get to experience it firsthand. Ultra quick dispatches, super hyped, and at the end of the day, I was able to get 3 back row rides in a row, and I didn't even have to leave my seat. I literally just stayed on my same seat for 3 back-to-back-to-back rides. So I ended up with a good 9 Fury 325 rides on my first day ever at Carowinds. I did not see that coming, so definitely an awesome surprise. Needless to say, make sure to ride Fury 325 and show the ride crew some love if you're ever at Carowinds. Number 6. The Incredible Hulk Coaster at Universal's Islands of Adventure. This coaster instantly became one of my all-time favorites when I got to experience it all the way back in 2000, and remains a classic must-do coaster anytime I'm in Islands of Adventure. And on my April trip down to Universal Orlando, I had probably the best ride I've ever had out of my 30 plus times riding the Hulk. I think it may have been my first ever front row ride, but it was super smooth, extremely forceful, and it just flew through the layout. Now, this one ride in and of itself didn't really surprise me on its own, but when you compare it to another front row ride on it the very next day, then we can start talking about surprising. The ride the following day just wasn't good. It seemed pretty rattly, and I got a decent amount of headbanging on the restraints this time, just not the most comfortable experience overall. I really couldn't believe there was that much of a difference from one day to the next. Similar time of day, similar weather, same row, but it just felt like a totally different ride. I'm guessing that most likely I got rides on 2 different trains, but still, I wouldn't think there'd be that much of a difference. At least I got my best ride ever, so it's still a world-class coaster in the right conditions. Alright, that brings us to the halfway mark of the countdown, guys. If you're enjoying the video so far, Do me a huge favor, hit the thumbs up, as it all helps with the YouTube algorithm and allows this content the ability to reach a larger audience. And also consider subscribing to the channel if you're looking for more content just like this. Now on to number 5. Number 5, Gatekeeper at Cedar Point. On the heels of completely different coaster experiences on both the Hulk and Fury 325, may I present to you my back-to-back rides on Gatekeeper. On June 3rd, I was at Cedar Point for their Coaster Mania event, and we had some evening ERT for Gatekeeper. So I snagged a ride in row 6 for starters, and I got what was a very rattly ride, and I didn't feel like the elements were really hitting at all, other than maybe that first drop. I didn't remember the ride being that rough, so that was a little bit of a surprise, but I figured, hey, let's go again since it's a walk-on, and on this next ride, I got my first ever front row ride on Gatekeeper, and man, I never realized how good this coaster could be. But more importantly, how truly night and day it was compared to row 6. Front row had no rattle at all, the hang time on the first drop was awesome, the inversions, every aspect of the ride was 100% improvement over row 6. I didn't think I've ever experienced that much of a contrast between different rows. From now on, I will always try to request and wait a little extra for that front row on Gatekeeper. Number 4, Mystic Timbers at Kings Island. Another new coaster credit and new park credit, if you can believe it. I had my first ever visit to Kings Island along with my first ever ride on Mystic Timbers during Passholder Preview Day this year. And can I just say that I was completely blown away by how much I love Kings Island, for starters. But as far as Mystic Timbers goes, I had no idea that a wooden coaster could be this smooth, quick, and aggressive all at the same time. The wooden coasters I'd had the most experience with riding growing up were Mean Streak and Blue Streak, so Mystic Timbers just sort of blew my mind a little bit. As far as expectations go, I figured I'd definitely like the ride, but I never thought I'd end up liking it more than other steel coasters in the park, like Orion. Regardless of wood or steel, this is simply just one of the best coasters out there, period, and has a pretty safe spot currently in my top 15. And by the way, I hope it doesn't sound like I'm bashing Orion in this video, because I think it really is a great coaster, and it's like right there neck and neck with Mystic Timbers in my rankings. Anyway, go ride Mystic Timbers at Kings Island, especially if you want to change your mind about wooden coasters. Number 3, Iron Gwazi at Busch Gardens, Tampa. Before I talk about the ride itself, the first thing I was surprised about was how often guests would have to exit the ride vehicle after boarding because the restraints couldn't close properly on them. This was a common occurrence on both of my visits to the park that week and really slowed down the dispatches. I don't know why this is the case for Iron Gwazi. Maybe guests aren't aware of the test seat out front, but a similar ride like Steel Vengeance doesn't seem to have this issue nearly as often, with guests not being able to fit into the seats. I think I've only seen this happen like once on Steel Vengeance, and close to a dozen times on Iron Gwazi. Let me know down in the comments if this is the norm, or if I was just there on an outlier of a week. Alright, let's get to the coaster itself. Simply put, Iron Gwazi is the king of met expectations. Which may not sound like a compliment, but I can assure you it is. I absolutely expected it to end up in my top 5, which it did. I expected it not to necessarily be better than, but to at least rival Velocicoaster and Steel Vengeance, and firmly land itself within my top 3, which it did. My first ride was back row, and it was great, outstanding even. My high expectations were met, nothing surprising about the coaster whatsoever, until of course, I got a front row night ride just a few hours later, and it was essentially life-changing, like one of the top 5 ride experiences I've ever had on any coaster ever. I mean, I knew a night ride would be better, but I didn't think the ride had that much room for improvement. Plus, I was surprised I ended up preferring the front row over the back row, which I was able to confirm a few days later when I got in 6 more rides. For some reason, the front row just hits different for me, which I truly did not expect. Overall, for now, I have it ranked as my number 3 coaster, but let me know in the comments where you have it ranked, and are you on team front row or back row? And I almost forgot to mention, I do have a video of my initial Iron Gwazi thoughts and reactions to the night ride, along with that first ride, if you want to check it out. I'll go ahead and put a link down in the description. Number 2, Vortex at Carowinds. I'll get right to the point on this one. Vortex was a new credit for me, and I had pretty low expectations since it's an older B&M stand-up coaster, a model I don't particularly care for already, but I didn't expect to have my worst ride ever on any coaster. Here's my initial reaction. So yeah, Vortex right behind me, never again. That was quite the unpleasant experience, to say the least. Nothing good came out of that at all. Nothing good came out of that ride. The headbanging, my ears both hurt right now. One of my ears, like, even kind of like suction cups to the side of one of the restraints. That's a one and done roller coaster for me there. I remember Mantis being a lot better than that, especially. Ugh. At least Vortex will always be super memorable from this experience, and that is quite the big surprise if you ask me. So in a weird way, I owe a big thank you to Vortex. I'm sure there have to be at least some Vortex fans out there somewhere, so let's hear it down in the comments if you think I should give the ride another chance next time I'm at Carowinds. Alright, we're almost to the number 1 spot, but I wanted to throw in a quick honorable mention to the Racer at Kings Island, which just barely missed the top 10 list. The Racer was a new credit for me, and I didn't have any expectations at all, really. At worst, I knew it could potentially be just a super rough, older wooden coaster. But I was pleasantly surprised on how smooth and fun this 50-year-old coaster was. Not to mention, I didn't expect it to have as much airtime as it did. Kings Island does a marvelous job maintaining this classic coaster, and I'm going to make sure I ride it every time I'm at Kings Island from now on. Number 1, Copperhead Strike at Carowinds. The sleeper hit of all sleeper hits. I expected to like Copperhead Strike a lot because, well, it's a multi-launch coaster with some cool inversions, and I'm a sucker for anything with a launch. Seriously, throw in a launch on any ride and it automatically makes it better in my book. Anyway, I knew Copperhead Strike had close to a 0% chance of being a negative experience in my eyes, but what I didn't expect is that I would like this better than Fury 325, that it would become my favorite coaster at Carowinds, and that it would ultimately end up in my top 5 coaster rankings. The ride is just so wacky with some of its elements. I never knew I was a big fan of hang time before this ride, but here we are, starting the ride out with an awesome JoJo roll right out of the gate, literally. The hang time continues throughout the various ride loops, and it throws in plenty of pops of ejector to have you flying out of your seat. Overall, for me, just a totally unique experience compared to other rides out there, and just pure fun. I was laughing the whole way through the first ride. I keep using the term wacky for this ride, but I think it's pretty fitting. If Willy Wonka attempted to build Velocicoaster, I imagine it would come out as something very similar to Copperhead Strike. POVs and other ride footage do not do this ride enough justice and tend to make it look a little more tame and slow than how it really runs, so I'd recommend making Copperhead Strike a priority alongside Fury 325 on your Carowinds visit. Random side tip, but Copperhead Strike's capacity isn't that great, so you actually might just want to go ahead and go on it first thing if you're at Carowinds. I mean, Fury is slow in the morning anyway, right? But there you have it, guys, my top 10 most surprising coasters so far in 2022. Do you agree or disagree with my reasoning on any of these? And what have been some of your most surprising coaster experiences so far this year? Please let me know down in the comments, as I love to hear everyone's different takes on all the great rides out there. Anyway, that's going to do it for today. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to hit the thumbs up if you enjoyed the video, and why not subscribe for more theme park news, tips, tricks, and adventures. As always, I've been Mike with Trout Takes, and we'll see you all soon.